Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. An interesting topic. Let's do it. People who have heard deathbed confessions. What are some of the interesting ones you've heard? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe.
My grandma confessed to murder on her deathbed. Usually you'd think it was the pain relief, but she was such an eccentric that it was actually believable. We traced all her ex-husbands, partners, and any other likely candidates, and fortunately no one was missing or died an untimely death, but sometimes I wonder. My dad has Alzheimer's and ended up in a secure ward. He was blind and almost deaf. I was visiting him one day. He didn't know who I was, but he started talking about me. He said I had done better than him in life and that he was proud of me. He was a quiet man in real life and never told me that when I was growing up. Looking back, he did things that my dumbass never realized were for me. When he retired, his colleagues asked what he'd like as a present. He chose a scientific calculator. This was in the 1970s. He had no use for it. He gave it to me for university. I thought he was just passing it on, not realizing that he'd asked for it with me in mind. I have an amazing one. My great-grandmother lived a very long and interesting life. She was in her 20s, and in the Great Depression, she had a wild streak from those days that we don't know much about, to the point that we actually don't know our great-grandfather's name, just a husband she took later. Over the course of her nearly 100-year life, she collected owls, literally thousands of owl figurines. She had clocks, wall hangings, pot holders, lamps, stained glass art, salt shakers, and more little figurines than you could imagine, all depicting owls. We all wondered about the importance of the owls. She never talked about them, we just all knew she loved owls. Well, when she was nearing death at the age of 98 or 99, and the doctor said she had days, my grandparents went and talked to her, and they asked her if she had anything she wanted to share or ask before she went. She thought for a moment, then said, "I never understood the owls." It turns out, she didn't really give a shit about owls. As we could piece together, sometime in the 40s or 50s, perhaps she bought either a trivet or a set of salt and pepper shakers that were owls. Then someone got her the other. Those were the oldest owls anyone could remember. But from there, someone got her an owl to match, probably a potholder or placemat, and all of a sudden, her kitchen was owl-themed. From there it snowballed. The owls flowed like wine, baffling her for 60 years, eventually taking over as the bulk of her personal belongings. The moral is, if you're not actually into something, mention it early. My grandma suffered from dementia for many years before she passed. It got so bad that she didn't remember who her family was and would barricade herself in her home because she was scared of everyone. She even forgot she smoked and would find her cigarettes months later after forgetting when they were, claiming she was desperate for one. She'd put them away after one, and that would be her again for months. The only memories she had left at the end were that her sister used to be able to play the piano beautifully, and her husband, her childhood sweetheart, was gone, but she didn't know where. He'd died sometime earlier. She spent her days waiting for him to come home from wherever he was. "My John will be home soon," she would say, or someone would walk past the window and she'd double take and say, "I thought that was my John." It was heartbreaking to watch her deteriorate until she was on her deathbed, unaware of anything or anyone. I went to say my goodbyes to her in hospital, and she held my hand and told me how much she loved me, how she was ready to go be with John now. In that moment, she remembered who I was, what was happening to her, and that her husband, my granddad, had already gone. She went to sleep not long after that, and I'm forever thankful I managed to say goodbye and tell her how much I loved her too. I've held on to that moment for so long without really digesting it in any way that writing this just tore my heart out. I miss them both so much, but I know they're finally together again somewhere. Not my story, but that of a hospice worker who spoke to my class. For those who don't know, hospice is a method of end-of-life care that focuses on alleviating the emotional and physical pain of a dying person to ease their passing, rather than combating their imminent death. One of her patients was a bedbound woman in her 90s who was generally unresponsive but had flashes of recognition and engagement. It's hard to gauge that level to which unresponsive patients are detached from their surroundings, so they encouraged family members to keep them company in hopes of soothing the patient. Now, this patient was from a U.S. state that prided itself on its state university and the university's football team. The woman's family had attended this university for 4 or 5 generations. During her hospice care, however, her great-granddaughter was the first in the family to decide to go to a different school, the rival state's university, in fact. Her family was supportive of her decision, but often joked about her being the rebel or Judas or what have you. One day they were all sitting around the woman's bedside, teasing the girl about her decisions. Suddenly the patient sat up, looked at her great-granddaughter, said, "Traitor," and effing died. This isn't a confession, but I just wanted to share the last thing my grandfather said to me before he passed away due to lung cancer. I was about to go to Rome for a school trip, and my family was told to get my mind on something else for a few days. Before I left, I wanted to say goodbye, as it was possibly the last time I could talk to him. He told me, "Have fun, boy. I'll see you next week." I went to Rome, and when I came back, he was already in a deep sleep due to medication. He wanted to peacefully pass away while sleeping. I came back the next week, and he was sleeping when I went to visit him. I told him everything I did in Rome, even though I knew he wouldn't wake up. The next morning, he passed away. My grandmother said to me, "He waited for you." I still miss him so much. My great-uncle actually confessed to having 2 illegitimate sons right before he kicked the bucket in front of his own children and grandchildren. The crazy thing was that none of his children knew about this life of his. Not even my great-aunt knew about it, because she would have made a huge fuss if she were alive at the time and knew about it. What was crazier was that these 2 sons had already passed away 5 and 7 years ahead of him, respectively. He was 98 years old, and his invisible sons were 65 and 69 years old. The children found out that one of the invisible sons was actually a teacher at a school that his granddaughters attended when they were in high school. Nevertheless, his children decided to reach out to the children of his invisible sons. They got connected and learned more stuff about my grandfather. The craziest thing was that I actually dated one of the granddaughters of one of the invisible sons, the one who passed away at the age of 69. Talking about a few degrees of separation, eh?
These deathbed confessions of having essentially a secret family are rough. I mean, I've read the ones about people who said they've committed a horrible crime, but knowing your surviving family members could have half-siblings, that's pretty psychologically heavy to put on people.
My great-grandfather was in his mid-90s when he died. Health was always good, but a benign tumor deemed too dangerous to operate on at his age went septic. He died a week later. I went to visit him in the hospital. My family used to see him a lot, but there was a falling out between him and my grandma several years before, so we stopped seeing them. Funny enough, though, I constantly ran into him at the store, and we always had nice chats. Anyway, in the hospital, he told me not to worry about him. Most everyone he's known was dead, and he was ready to die. The week he felt himself getting sick, he knew something was off, and made arrangements to get my great-grandma into a nursing home. He took care of her with her Alzheimer's, so he wouldn't die until he knew she was taken care of. They were married for over 70 years. My favorite story is that every Sunday for over 50 years, he would drop my great-grandma off at church and then sit in the car and wait for her. He hated religion, but loved his wife. Not a deathbed confession exactly. I was a hospice volunteer and worked with a man with a brain tumor. He was in pretty good shape except for that. He was going nuts in the nursing home, and one day I took him for a ride around town. He had grown up there. It seemed like every other block he would point out an old building and say, "Used to be a whorehouse there. The empty lot used to be a building there, and it had a pretty good whorehouse there. There was a whore there until it burned down." We passed by this old, odd-looking apartment building that had more doors than it should have, and it appeared some of them were sealed up. He said, "That used to be a crib, and each door had a small room behind it, and each whore had her own room." We passed under a railroad bridge, and he pointed to a flat area and said, "There used to be a black woman who ran the best whorehouse in that state right there." I finally laughed and said, "Guess I know where you spent your youth doing." My mother ran a nursing home growing up. From ages 5 to 10, I spent every weekend with residents. Because I was a kid, residents often confessed stuff they thought I wouldn't understand. 2 stick out. One is funny, one is not. A woman was dying, maybe about 96. She even had her last burst of energy or life where she thought she was better. This is common. A black delivery man came with some flowers. After he left, she looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "I can't believe I'm dying without having been with a colored man." The second one was while I was reading Bible verses to a resident. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to drop that baby in the well." This wasn't a deathbed confession, but more of a hospice. This man was an alcoholic. This isn't usually a problem because when in hospice you can get whatever you want as long as it's legal, but he was a violent drunk and was forbidden alcohol as a result. Anyway, between his requests for alcohol, he talked about how he and a friend got into a massive fight about land and his equipment being borrowed. As a result, they haven't spoken in 20 years. He said he didn't even know why it was such a big deal and regretted being that aggressive. He basically said he missed his best friend and wished they didn't lose all those years. I wasn't there to witness her confession, but the story leading up to it is intriguing. My mom was adopted and my grandparents never kept it a secret. They loved my mom like their own. When she was growing up, she tried to find out as much as she could about her and her adopted brother's birth parents. Back in those days, though, information like that wasn't exactly the easiest to find. My mom and uncle were brought to the orphanage with little to no information on each other, their biological parents, or else wisely requested to be kept secret. Eventually, my mom found enough information from the notes she had gathered, like which families might have been most likely to be related to her, and some property information one can find at the library, and she sort of pieced the puzzle together over her life. At a certain point, she was able to get the names of her mother and her brother's mother. She was able to find out that she was part of a big family with lots of brothers and sisters. But for my uncle, he found out that his mother had died not long after placing him for adoption. By the time she gathered all the information and found this much out, my mom was married, had my older sister, and was pregnant with me. I can't remember exactly what it was she found that led to it or if she heard something from someone, but she got a phone number. The phone number went to the house of her biological mother. She called, and the voice of a young boy answered. My mom asked for the name she knew, and she heard, "Yeah, 1 second. Hey mom, phone's for you." My mom and her talk. It wasn't an easy conversation, and I'm just going to refer to my mom's mom as Biogran from here. Biogran is now comfortable with my mom contacting her at all. She doesn't ask my mom a lot of questions, but mom says that she was just going to talk, and if Biogran wanted to hang up at any point she could. My mom gave her a short version of the story of her life, and then the conversation was over. Biogran after that would send letters to my mom on occasion, but Biogran made a point of telling my mom she could never be found out by the rest of her family. And Biogran carried that secret with her until the day of her death. One of her daughters asked her, "Will you tell us where you went when you went away at that time?" And Biogran finally confessed that she had gone to a home for unwed mothers all those years ago to have my mom, the child of her affair. I've met 2 of my bio aunts, and sadly both of them passed a few years ago, but dang. My great uncle had pancreatic cancer and was very frail because of it. I helped him bathe, use the restroom, and change him each morning. Not his last words to me, but something he said that has stuck with me since. "I hate feeling so useless. I can't do this anymore. I'm so sorry you have to do this." I told him I never minded doing this for him. I loved him so much, and I'd always be there for him. I had to move away a few weeks later because my mom wanted me back home as I was living with my grandparents and him at the time. He passed away shortly after, and his cat, whom he had for almost 30 years, died a few days after him. He was a good man. Not a confession, but a denial and solid information that helped us clear a few pending matters. I worked for a federal law enforcement agency. We covered major felonies, some of which relate to organized crime, not mafia per se, but open-ended criminal enterprises. We had a mid-level player as a suspect for a string of cargo thefts, robberies, etc. I knew him for years, arrested him several times. He taunted us a fair bit. Lung cancer got a hold of him before we could build a solid case. Things went downhill fast. I went to see him at home just before he transferred to hospice. That he did at least 50% of what we suspected is an open secret. I knew it, he knew it. For whatever reason, she chose to give me a break. He said, "If I give you something, Will you sit on it for a few weeks? Initially, I could not agree. What if he was going to leak information about something in progress, etc.? He assured me that it could wait. I agreed. So he said, I know that you're looking for me for the blank. I didn't do it. He admitted wanting to do it and told me he was responsible and where we could find solid evidence to implicate 5 or 6 people. Why did he tell me? He said the other guy never treated anybody right. I did not ask him to elaborate. I moved on the information about 3 weeks later, after the informant died. He never had to share an information source because he pointed us to a significant corroborating information.